The NATO defense ministers meeting is in full swing over in Brussels, and for the very first time, the so-called IP4 nations, including South Korea, are taking part in the meeting. Let's turn to Professor Andrew Millard for more. Welcome.
Good morning.
So like I said, IP4 nations taking part in the NATO defense ministers meeting this year. Why the need for the IP4 nations to participate now?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for having me on this morning. So I think we need to remember that for the past 3 years, these IP4 countries, so South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they have been involved in the NATO summit with the presidents, with the prime ministers. So this is not a new move. However, this is now just a sign of the further deepening of the relationship between NATO and these IP4 countries. So this is very significant, especially at the moment as we have rising tensions in Asia, so between South Korea and North Korea, including the relationship with North Korea and Russia, the involvement of China, China-Taiwan relations. So all of this is very significant that now NATO is really expanding its alliance, its partnership with these countries in the Indo-Pacific. However, we do need to still be a little bit cautious. China has also recently kind of warned NATO not to drag European issues into the Asia-Pacific region. So while this is a very significant step forward for the relationship between NATO and the IP4, I do think we do need to have a little bit of caution there as well.
That's a good point. And considering the geopolitical and regional risks, their participation may be timely. Now, Professor Millard, how can South Korea then contribute and work with NATO members when it comes to defense?
Well, potentially, South Korea could have a huge role. Now, we should also remember South Korea, for the past few years, has been actively involved in other operations. So, for example, the EU Operation Atalanta, which is involving piracy of Somalia. The South Korean Navy has been very active in the Indian Ocean working together. So in terms of military support, we know it has the capabilities to do that. It's already, in terms of humanitarian aid, economic aid, and so on, been very active in Ukraine and other areas. So that's all going to continue. Where it could further increase is with the sale of weapons to the NATO members, to other members. But this would require the South Korean domestic law to be adapted so that we can start exporting, selling weapons abroad. And really right now, the domestic South Korean defense industry, no pun intended, is booming. And especially if we relate this back to the IP4, in recent years, there's been a lot of cooperation between South Korea and Australia, in particular, in the defense industry.
The Ukraine crisis will no doubt top the agenda at this year's meeting. The question is, will Ukraine be able to, garner much support from the NATO members this time as well? What do you think?
So we have to be realistic and say that it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to garner a huge amount of extra support than what they've already been getting. So we have to remember this conflict started almost 3 years ago now. We're closing in on the 3-year mark. Of course, there's going to be fatigue setting in with the European members, the European Union as well. So far, the EU has already spent 88 billion euros supporting Ukraine. It's implemented 14 separate sanctions packages against Russia. So there has been a huge amount of support in terms of economic aid, humanitarian aid, weapons. So I think that will continue. They will not stop supporting Ukraine, but I think it's unlikely that Zelenskyy is going to get that extra support that he really needs and wants.
Well, at the same time, unveiling his, so-called victory plan, Zelenskyy reiterated his desire to his country to join NATO. Now, how achievable or, realizable his desire to join NATO at this point?
Again, we have to be honest and say this is much more idealistic rather than realistic. So Zelensky's been talking about joining NATO for a while.
Right.
It's impossible that Ukraine will join while there is an ongoing conflict, because that would just mean that all of the NATO members would be automatically pulled into this conflict, and there is no will or desire amongst any of the NATO members to join this conflict and potentially escalate this into World War III.
Well, on top of the ongoing Ukraine war, now speculations are high that North Korean soldiers are being dispatched to Russia to help its fight against Ukraine. Why is it even necessary for NATO defense ministers to discuss such speculation at this year's meeting?
So this is very important. What this shows us is that the relationship between North Korea and Russia, it's getting much deeper. It's no longer just about sort of selling weapons. It's now really a much more strengthening, deepening relationship. And why is this significant? Because previously, back in July, in the Washington Summit Declaration, the NATO members already said that this sort of relationship, the trade that's happening, the cooperation is illegal. So that's very important. But it also means if North Korea is going to start deploying troops to Ukraine or to Russia, to allow Russia to then send Russian troops to Ukraine, this can only mean the conflict will be prolonged even further. And NATO, they want this war, they want this conflict to be over as soon as possible. If North Korea sends soldiers, all that's going to happen is it's going to be prolonged even further.
Alrighty, Professor Millard, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us this morning. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.